We started a series on the parables last week. This will be the first parable we're going to look at this week. We did an introduction last week to the parables of Jesus Christ. By the way, I'm not drinking coffee this morning. I'm drinking hot tea because I've got a cold. And so I've got some hot tea on this side and some cold water on this side. Maybe with the hot-cold combination, I'll be able to get through the message this morning. So if I get choked up, it's probably not my emotions this morning. It's probably this wretched cold I'm trying to kick. Matthew chapter 13. Read some scripture here this morning before we look at this parable. Beginning in verse 3. And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he had sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But other fell into good ground, and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Probably one of the most commonly heard and possibly misused parables is the one concerning the sower, the seed, and the ground. Much speculation has been done for centuries on this parable. I found some sources that had preachers preaching on this parable from 100, 200 AD and speculating and having some pretty interesting interpretations on this parable all the way back then, and it hasn't changed since. It's regrettable that there should be controversy over this parable because it's one of the few parables where Jesus actually explains it all. And yet there still is some controversy. What is this tongue? What does this ground mean? What is the seed? What is the sowing? And if you understand from our message last week, the parables are meant to be simple. They're not meant to be complicated. They're meant to be simple, and they're meant to teach a simple yet dynamic spiritual truth. And that's the purpose in them. This parable is no different than any of the others in that regard. And that's why Jesus tells a simple story. This parable is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are no parables actually found in John. Except for similes. Jesus says, I am the door, I am the good shepherd. Those are not necessarily parables. There are no lengthy parables found in the book of John. And most of the parables are not found in the other three gospel accounts. But this parable is. It is not the first one Jesus told, and yet it is the parable Jesus told when he was explaining to the disciples why he would speak in parables. And so as very much in that context, there is reason behind that. He tells this parable with the mindset of explaining to the disciples why he was going to speak in parables. That's why last week we looked at Matthew 13, the stuff in between this parable. In between the time when Jesus explains why, the beginning of the parable, then Jesus explains why he's going to speak in parables, and then the interpretation of the parable is the way it comes in this text. Jesus tells a simple story here, though. It's pretty simple, right? Verses 3 through 9 is a pretty easy story to understand. A guy goes out, a farmer, he goes and he sows some seed. 3 of the grounds don't yield very good fruit, 1 does. And that's the simple story. There's no details explaining the labor of the sower, nor the type of seed, or whether the sowing was done the best way or any of that, because none of those details are important. That's not the important thing. Remember, in a parable, as we looked at last week, what is important is what is said. Everything else is not that important. So it'd be in poor taste with God's text for us to try to add things to a parable, to try to understand it, simply to take it as its simple nature that it is intended for. Agriculturally speaking, this was a common way to plant grain in those days. It was to clear all the old growth from the land and to smooth out the soil. All the ground looked the same because it was all smoothed out on the onset, but what the truly good ground would be revealed by the fruit. The truly good ground would be revealed by the fruit. The others maybe looked good at the onset, But what they did with the seed, what the seed did in that ground, determined whether it was truly good or not. Good in the sense not of morally good. Obviously, soil is not morally good or immorally bad. But rather, good in the sense that it's fruit producing. Producing that which is beneficial. The farmer would broadcast and spread the seeds. The workers would scratch them into the ground to push them into the soil. This was done before what were called the early rains. And then when the early rains would come, the seeds would germinate. As more irrigation sometimes took place and then rains ensued, the farmers would begin to get a better picture as to what their crop would yield. And then when the latter rains came in the fall, the fullness, the last push of the seeds of the plants in bringing forth their fruit would become abundant after the latter rains in the fall. And then there'd be the reaping. At that point, it'd be clear as to which was the fruit-producing soil. A simple story that would be understood by the people of the day. And yet it's a story that most did not understand. Because unlike some other parables or fables in Greek, Jewish culture, this story seemingly has no moral. Did you notice that? And Jesus just says, there's 4 kinds of ground. This is what they did. He that has ears to hear, let him hear. And then he just ended it. And I can assume that most of the people sat there and probably went, okay, is this man a rabbi or a farmer? We know that. Obviously, the thorns will choke the plants. Obviously, the stony ground's not going to have a deep root. Obviously, and so the plant's not going to survive. Obviously, the hard packed ground, the wayside ground, it's not even going to let the seed get in. And obviously the good ground is going to produce 30, 60, and 100-fold fruit. But this is why Jesus ends the parable with the phrase, "Who hath ears to hear, let him hear." In all 3 Gospels where this parable is given, there is similarities and some differences. Not differences in the big picture of it, but maybe differences in the language of how it was addressed, expressed. And there really is no description in any of this parable, in any of the Gospels, as to what makes the ground good. It just says it's good ground. It's good ground. But with today's understanding of agriculture, I think, and looking at the context, I think we can make the assumption that the good ground was loose, deep, and rich. Because that corresponds to the 3 negative things of the other ground. It wasn't loose, it wasn't deep, and it wasn't rich. I think where most of the error in this interpretation of this parable has occurred is trying to make too much of the ground and to what it really typifies or illustrates. Luke's account is the only one that even mentions anything about being saved or salvation. And yet, that has come to be the default interpretation of this text, is that the different grounds are different kinds of saved or unsaved people. And people will say, well, the first, and then you get into these debates. You probably don't because you don't run around with other preachers. But sometimes when I run around with other preachers, we get into these debates. So what about the first and second ground? Was it saved or not saved? Or this guy believed? Or was the third ground saved? What about the fourth ground in these debates? And they're really kind of silly sometimes. Because that's not even the point of the parable. The parable's not about salvation. It's not about the salvation of souls. It's not about whether one ground is a saved ground, the other ground is not a saved ground. It's really about what Jesus says in verse 9. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. It's really about the heart of a person in how they receive the word, which is the seed. How they receive the word. And you know what that applies to? Who that applies to? That applies to saved and unsaved people alike. How we receive the seed. Now, what is the seed? Let's jump over, I'm going to jump a little bit in this passage to look at the interpretation. Verse 18, he begins the interpretation of the parable. Hear ye therefore the parable of the sower. Very obviously, Jesus is the sower in this parable. He's speaking, and that's why he says, he that hath ears to hear, can we understand that he that has ears to hear what I'm saying